Welcome to the Business Trendsetter podcast, where we talk about trends and how to grow your business. My name is Manny Turan.
And I'm Adam Harton.
We are Spark Partners. We're here to help you grow your business by fully understanding trends, understanding your customers, and really helping to open your eyes to what's happening around the world. Now, Adam, I went to Mexico over the weekend and spent some time with some friends down there and was sort of blown away at what I was exposed to. So usually I go down to Mexico and you're able to have a meal and it's about half the cost of what it is in the US. I mean, these are nice meals, and there's a place that I usually stop at along the side of the road, and you can pick up 3 tacos and a Coke for about $4. Well, this time around, I stopped by, I had my lunch, and when I went to go pay, it was about $8.50. So basically, my taco meal was double what it was just about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, right before the pandemic. So it kind of brought to perspective some things that I wanted to throw out there. And that's the idea of, we've got these inflation situations happening here in the US. Obviously, the Fed raised the interest rates. But what really amazed me is how much effect that had on the bordering state of Sonora, just south of the border here. Now, of course, the two economies are very, very tightly intertwined. But it just made me think, we're talking about some inflation issues here. We're talking about some trends. What are your thoughts on why my tacos were double what they were just a few years ago?
One follow-up question. Were you paying in pesos or were you paying in dollars?
Well, when I went down there, I went and I got pesos. So I had pesos on the way down. On the way back up, I paid in dollars. And there was not much difference in, maybe a 50 cents difference in the two.
Okay. Well, as I've said in previous podcasts, the reason we're undergoing so much inflation right now is because costs are being driven up because of the pandemic. So in the pandemic, when we shut down the businesses, then when people wanted to restart the businesses, the amateur economists in the government all thought, it was like a light switch. You turn the switch down, it shuts off, you flip the switch on, it comes back on again. And of course, business people don't behave that way. When you force them to shut down and they close down and they let the people go, whether they were paying them or not, they shut the plants down. Then whenever they have to make a decision, what do I want to reopen? If I do reopen, how will I reopen? And then when they start to say, well, I want to reopen, then they have to bring on the employees. And every employee has to say, well, do I want to go back to work or do I not want to go back to work? And we went through that period we called the Great Resignation. And now we have this whole quiet quitting movement. And people are saying, so to get the supply going again, to get the products all moving again, to get the truck drivers back in the seats, to get people in restaurants cooking the food, to get the farmers. The farmers got rid of a lot of inventory during the pandemic. They were depleting their herds in order to cash in because they didn't know what was going to happen, what would be going on next, whether or not they could. The processors, the meat processors, whether it be beef, chicken, or pork, they shut down. They drastically curtailed the number of employees they had. People didn't go to work, so they weren't processing as much food. Everybody has to decide how they're going to come back, and that means if there's not as much inventory of herd out there, then the price of the beef goes up or the pork goes up or the chicken goes up because you got to, get the herds back up big enough again, the flocks big enough. And that is going to be a 2 to 3 year process. Shutting it off took 3 months, turning it on is probably 3 years. As long as that happens, that's going to drive costs up. And then the people working at your roadside stand, I don't know if they're the same people that were there before, but, there was a group of people. There was somebody cooking food. There was somebody selling the food, somebody around a cash register, maybe somebody delivering food. Are all those the same people? Or did some of those people say, hey, I'm not interested in this anymore? And now they have to go recruit somebody new, and then they've got to pay them more money. That's a global phenomenon. This is not just a U.S. phenomenon. It's happening all over the world. People in Japan that were working 20-hour days got sick of it. So what's happening is it's the supply chain. The Federal Reserve sees this inflation and they think, our job is to try to control it. Well, the only way they know how to control it is to create a recession. Make interest rates so high that you won't spend any money, right? And you start saying, okay, I can't afford to buy anything. Like you went on your trip and you say, wow, it's so expensive. I guess what I'm going to do is I'm not going to go. I won't go on the trip next time. So, you bring demand down to balance it with the supply as it comes back up. And that gets rid of inflation, but it also gets rid of jobs, and it kills the economy. Your economic growth rate falls apart, all that kind of good stuff. But it just gets back to the fact that U.S. driving interest rates up has the impact of driving the value of the dollar up, which is a depressing effect on the global economy, including Mexico. And Mexico has long been a petro economy. The price of oil has dropped some 40%, I think, since the peak. So they don't have as many petrodollars to hand out to the people to push the economy along in Mexico. And so you're sitting with the problem of how do people in Mexico, just like people all over the world, get back to work. How do they get the corn? How do they get the beef or the pork for your asada? That's what's driving it up. And I don't think, and the the U.S. Federal Reserve isn't solving that problem. Again, they're just, in my opinion, exacerbating the problem. I've thought about that myself.
What's interesting is all these things are interrelated, and as business people, you've got to know that these things are interrelated. One of the interesting thoughts I just had is a number of years ago, I was involved with a group that did business between Mexico and the U.S. And one thing I learned is all of the beef processing happens in Mexico. So what happens is all the cattle that are collected here in Arizona, when they go to be processed, they're put on a train, they're sent down to Mexico, they are processed and put back on a train and shipped back. And you can imagine the amount of fuel and other things, costs associated with doing so, but it's still cheaper to do that than to have it processed here in the U.S. So now with the price of the fuel and all the other things with the inflation issues, then it's probably just driving all that cost back to the consumer.
Yes, that plus the fact that the free and open borders aren't what they used to be. If you go wind back the clock to the Bush 1 era and then the Clinton era and the North American Free Trade Agreement, and what we were trying to do was open up borders and increase global trade and improve the trade with Mexico was a big deal. You saw in the last administration, there was far less desire to have this sort of open trade. Closed borders was the approach. Tariffs was the approach. So what happens then is you've got people that it's more difficult to move the beef to Mexico to have it processed and then shipped back into the United States. And so if they don't have the beef, to process, to sell, then they have to pay more for domestic local beef or pork in order to buy and process it in Mexico. So again, it's what we're seeing here is a change, punctuated equilibrium. My language, when you have this big change and it causes big shifts. We had a global economy. That global economy is not as global as it once was. We had long supply chains that were very tightly controlled. People were managing by the hour ships and trucks and railroad cars. But the pandemic stopped it. Now getting that back up and running again, there are people saying, I don't want to do it. Right? You see China acting very differently than it used to act in the past in terms of what is it doing for trade. They're saber rattling about maybe they should take over Taiwan. Taiwan, of course, is where the vast majority of chips are made for the world. So everybody starts wondering, can we depend on chips from Taiwan? Russia invades the Ukraine. Literally thousands of people are being killed in a war. Software that was developed in the Ukraine and in Russia is no longer happening. Grain that was produced in the Ukraine that was shipped to Africa and other countries in Europe can't move out because the grain can't be harvested, or if it's harvested, it's sitting around and perhaps rotting in railroad cars. That is all causing prices to go up. And so it wasn't the pandemic that necessarily caused it, but what we've seen is a bunch of activities happen very quickly, meaning within 2.5, 3 years, and that was pushing us towards a different equilibrium. We're going from one equilibrium to a second. That's a punctuated equilibrium. So we're in an era now in which things are different, right? Things are different, and you're going to have to be ready for higher interest rates for 2 to 3 years. We'll probably have a recession, which means that things will slow down. So the high growth era that we had going into the pandemic, which was sort of artificially maintained during the pandemic, is probably going to trail off. the good companies are going to continue to be good companies. Companies that make a valuable product or service that people want will do well. But the ones that have been marginalized, they're going to struggle, and they'll get washed out. That's what happens in every recession. So I think we can anticipate that sort of change to occur.
Let's take the focus from the Sea of Cortez to the eastern seaboard there with what's happened.
From the Sea of Cortez to the Gulf of Mexico, huh? From one side of Mexico to the other.
Yeah, the whole situation with the hurricane there and all the the issues that happened in southern Florida, and the rebuilding is beginning again. It's a constant back and forth, and we've talked about what's happening with the whole climate change and all this. And I know you had some thoughts about that. You want to share them with us?
Well, I've been talking about climate change a lot for at least 10 years, somewhere between 10 and 12 years. People would hear every presentation I gave when I talked about trends and big trends. I would say, pay attention to the climate. Demographics was always number one. Climate and environmentalism was number two. And the interesting thing to me was that there were people who thought that was a political statement. And it's kind of like, I don't understand what's political about a global a planet that's warming, right? And if the planet warms, then it has consequences in terms of storms and the weather patterns and a lot of other, then that has secondary other additional impacts. I said, I'm not making a political statement at all. I'm just saying the planet is warming. And then but that tied back to the deniers, and it goes all the way back to the book that I wrote, Create Marketplace Disruption, How to Stay Ahead of the Competition, in which I talked about people that got locked into the status quo. And once they locked into the status quo, they just really didn't want to change, right? They had to sit there what they wanted, and they don't want the world to move forward. And I noticed in the period from 2010 to 2020, what we saw was this sort of movement, not just in business towards locking in and getting stuck in a way of thinking in a status quo, but I started seeing people living that way, right? And they started saying, well, this is the way I want to live. And so it became a political issue. And I think that's fascinating. Somebody that thinks that they can use politics to stop the world from improving. It's kind of
right.
Really, that's what these changes. You actually want the improvements. You want better health care. You want an easier way of life. You want more entertainment. But then at the same time, you want to have a small town. You don't want your cost of living to go up. You don't want to have to pay for a computer. You don't want to have to pay for a smartphone. But you want to have all the good stuff, but you don't want to have to pay for any of it. Gee, I don't quite understand that. It's a little bit like somebody back in the early 1900s saying, gee, I'd like to get from Chicago to Minneapolis quickly, but I don't want to have to pay for a car or a railroad ticket, right? I want to keep my horse, but I want to have these advances of being able to transport very quickly. So what we saw, people getting locked in, and so they started saying that things like climate change was a third rail, and it was a hot button, and I don't want to bring it up. And kind of like, well, okay. I mean, why you would ignore an important trend like this, like environmentalism and climate change, I don't know. And that's what's happened to the people of Florida. As you know, about 8 years ago, I did a pretty extensive analysis. I was living in Chicago, and I was tired of the cold weather, and I realized that my business wasn't predominantly in Chicago anymore. And I started to evaluate where could I move to live wherever I wanted to live. And I quickly decided I didn't want anything to do with living in Florida. And people would say, well, a lot of people move to Florida. Why don't you want to move to Florida? And I said, well, the first thing is the weather. I said, with climate change, the weather's going to be horrible. It's a warm place to be. It rains a lot. It has humidity. But that's always been that way. But I said, it's going to accelerate. It's going to get hotter. The thunderstorms are going to be bigger. The hurricanes are going to be bigger. They're going to be more frequent. And I can't give you what month and what year these bad things are going to happen. But if you just look at what's been happening in places like New Orleans and Houston, you start saying, wow, these were places that were difficult to live in. We got around those difficulties with air conditioner and pumps for water and dams and all this kind of stuff. But, you push that technology right up against the force of nature, literally dealing with climate change. And you're unlikely to hold back nature. It's very unlikely to happen. And so, as you know, I made a decision to move west. Now what happened is we have these towns like Fort Myers and Naples, that got very, very big in the last 10 years. I used to joke, did a lot of work for the National Association of Corporate Directors, and my joke was always there were more retired directors from boards of directors in Naples, Florida than anywhere else in the United States. I mean, when you went to NACD national events, the number of retired chairmen that were in Naples, Florida was a remarkably high number given the size of the town. And you just didn't hear about them in other places like you did in Naples. And now, I was like, why? Well, I like it. I can have a big boat. It's near the ocean, blah, blah, kind of have all the benefits. And I would say, but you do realize that you're running against these risks. And even chairmen of large corporations, I was having a conversation with a chairman of Merck one time, and even he would say, nobody can control the weather. So he ignored it because he had a mindset of what he wanted to do in his retirement. He wanted to do it in Naples, and he was going to go to Naples. And now the odds are very good that his house is gone, that his big boat is gone. He's probably suffered some pretty serious losses in this. And you see also that simultaneously as these people went to Florida, one of the other problems I always noticed with Florida was a lack of taxation. Because it has a very high retiree population, one of the highest in the United States. That means it has a low number of workers compared to the number of retirees. Retirees don't like to pay taxes. They don't want to pay income taxes. They don't want to pay property taxes. They don't want to pay sales taxes. And so when they go somewhere, they're always going for low taxes. So what happens when you have low taxes? Well, you don't have any money for infrastructure. So now, if you said, well, we ought to prepare for hurricanes by hardening up our bridges, reinforcing bridges, putting more water control systems in place, putting more pumps in place to control water, preparing for these enormous hurricanes. The reality is there's no money for it. And if you went to the population and said, we're at great risk of a wipeout from a big hurricane, then people react with, I don't want to pay for it. And so I'm not going to pay for it. So you see the culture of Florida become much like that. A lot of people there, a lot of people moving there, everybody having a great time at the party, but it's kind of like everybody's having a great time at the party, not realizing that, trouble is a brew and something's going to happen. And now it is hit, and it is hit very, very hard. And the fascinating thing is the politicians and how they react to it. So, these politicians. So, Michael Rubio, Senator Rubio. When I got his first name right. Senator Rubio, when Hurricane Sandy hit New Jersey, he voted against authorizing money to go to New Jersey for repairs in New Jersey because of Hurricane Sandy. Because he thought that it was stupid of the people of New Jersey to not be better prepared for the hurricane, and that it was not a federal government issue to help the people of New Jersey when they got damaged by this hurricane, that the people of New Jersey should take care of it for themselves. Now here's Rubio, Marco Rubio, and his state has been hit really, really hard, and he's got his hand out to the federal government. A complete hypocrisy, total hypocrisy. It doesn't have anything to do with what party he's a member of.
Yeah, that's a politician for you.
Yeah. Point is just like you've got a state, you undertaxed your people, you did not prepare your infrastructure, you overdeveloped the land. You should have known that you were adding all these people on the land. That when a hurricane hit, there would be you wouldn't be able to provide support for them. They couldn't evacuate fast enough. You didn't have enough roadways to get them out of there. All these things that would happen, but nobody planned for any of that. Nobody wanted to admit there was climate change. And in fact, the governor of Florida has been a long-term climate change denier, saying that it's all just hunk. It doesn't mean anything. Then meanwhile, you got tidal waves coming in at Miami Beach, taking it out. All of this kind of thing reminds me of my youth. And I grew up in a small town not far from the Arkansas River. And the Arkansas River, most of the time, runs as a fairly small river. Certainly, it's more like a western river, which kind of looks like a large creek to people in the east. And then, you'll get big rains, and the big rains could be up in the mountains, or the big rains could be in the plains, and then the river swells dramatically. And there were always people that lived down by the river. Now, going down by the river was interesting because it was cooler to live by the river. Literally, the evaporation made it a cooler temperate for living. It was easy to grow things. So if you had a vegetable garden, it grew very, very easily in those soils, and the water level was very easy to pump water up. There was a lot of nice things about it. And those of us that lived there always enjoyed going to have picnics by the river, fishing by the river, spending time by the river. But the people who lived there lived in a situation where they could be easily flooded. And when I was old enough to remember the first one of these floods that went in and took out hundreds of homes up and down the river within a fairly short distance of where I lived. And I was kind of like, oh my, where are those people going to live? And my father said, well, they're going to move back. And they did. And I was kind of like, what? Your house got wiped out. You have to go back. You have to re-drill your well. You have to redo your septic system. And you got to put a brand new house on. And you just went through a flood. What makes you think it's not going to happen again? Then sure as the world, 7 years later, boom, they wiped those people out again. Now, this was a small enough number of houses that, they probably lost their insurance and, they personally suffered from it. But I was like, why do you move back? What does it take to get you to understand that you're not supposed to be there? But let's look at what's going on now in Florida. We're talking about rebuilding. Well, what's happened since Katrina hit New Orleans? I can say that I was a big fan of New Orleans. Have been for a long time. New Orleans today is nothing like it was pre-Katrina. You can go right down on Bourbon Street. You go right down in the main central part of New Orleans. There's still a devastation from Hurricane Katrina, which was more than a decade ago. And even though, people there want to rebuild and want to come back, it takes a lot of money and it takes a lot of time. And where are you going to get it? Louisiana is not a highly populous state, doesn't have a whole lot of money. Again, it's a low tax state, don't like to tax their populace for infrastructure. So as a result, New Orleans isn't what it used to be. Florida will not be what it used to be. Now, I don't know how many of these people think they're going to return, but did you not wisen up enough to realize that it's going to happen again? And you ought to get out of Dodge. I mean, seriously, a hurricane went right through the middle of the state, flooding people all the way inland to Orlando, and you're going to go back and rebuild. I think it would be smart of you to get out a map from the climatologists and look at where's the better place to be. But I can say the same thing from where I moved to. When I was in Chicago, I moved to Vegas, and I loved Vegas a lot. But I started to notice there were some real serious issues with how water was priced and how water was handed out. That the people that controlled the water district were from Arizona, and there was a lot of water going to Phoenix for growing crops and agriculture between Phoenix and Tucson. And that meant it wasn't going to people in Nevada and Southern California, and Lake Mead levels were dropping. And I got to thinking, the more this went on, I'm thinking, this is a precarious situation for Las Vegas. Because if the water drops down, the political power does not reside in Nevada to deal with this problem. The political power is between Arizona and California. And so I had an opportunity to sell my house. I did. And I just, put most of my belongings in storage and rented an apartment and started spending more time with my girlfriend. And the reality was, I said, okay, it's time to get out of Vegas, because if somebody's going to address this water issue, it's going to become a big problem. But I just get fascinated at how many people live in this world of deny.
It's prevalent everywhere.
Say, I'm going to be okay, when in fact things are changing around you. It's what we call status quo risk. And status quo risk is really the amount of risk that builds up because you stay in one place, not anticipating that things will change.
Yeah,
if you're going to live in Florida,
change, right?
Yeah, if you're going to live in Florida, you need to be somehow, some way able to say that I can withstand hurricanes. Now, I'm not an expert on hurricanes, but you'd have to have the right kinds of dwelling and everything to say, in the right distance between the dwellings. I mean, if you just watch the news, you'll see, I was looking at a concrete buoy or something like that. There was a pier or something. The thing literally weighed 4,000 pounds, was sitting 2 blocks away from the ocean in somebody's driveway. All right. What the heck are they going to do? How are they going to get that out of there, right? So you got to start saying, come on, people, let's have some common sense. When you look at the hundreds of boats piled up on each other that are, blocks and blocks away from the Gulf of Mexico, you kind of got to say, look, this is clearly a big ass problem. And, are you just going to move back there? Are you going to go back and re-drill your well and redo your septic like those people in the Arkansas River just to know that another one's coming? Another one is coming. And it's not like an earthquake where you can say, well, maybe it's 100 years away or maybe it's one. We don't know. This is someone who say, no, it's going to happen. We're having 1 in 1,000-year floods all over the country this summer. And we've been doing that consistently for 5 years. And it's just going to continue to be that way. By the way, if you take a look at a map and you want to see where the best place is, if you were 5 years old and you wanted to live somewhere great when you're 50, the best place to be is the upper Midwest. It's going to be so hot and dry. Texas is going to be almost impossible to live. Arizona is going to get hotter and hotter. It'll get more and more difficult to live. California is going to continue to have a drought. It'll be problematic. The Pacific Northwest is going to be laced with all kinds of rain. But the climate in the upper Midwest, specifically around Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, in that area, is going to be warmer, more temperate. It'll be a much nicer place to live, play golf, probably 9 to 10 months out of the year and 50 years there. But you will have to deal with tornadoes, because Tornado Alley is going to be a lot bigger than it used to be.
Well, a lot of people, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, they put their head in the sand and they don't want to see what's happening. Even in the last podcast and the one before that, we talk about how people, they see these things happening in the world, but they freeze. They don't do any planning. Whatever they used to do as far as a true strategic plan was never, first of all, true strategic plan. And secondarily, they just stop planning because they feel as though whatever they do to plan, and it's going to change. And again, I think part of the idea here is you've got to plan for that change. You've got to plan that
absolutely.
It's going to happen, and how can you be ready for it?
So right now, Putin is threatening to drop or to send out some nuclear bombs. And there's a lot of people say, well, I can't do anything about it, so I'm just going to pretend like, it's not going to happen. Well, really? Really? Because I think the odds are good that he might do something stupid. Is he going to send off an intercontinental ballistic missile? He can send off 100 of them. But if he does, where will they go? But certainly I'm looking at it. I'm saying, what's the most likely outcome? Where would he probably launch a nuclear bomb? What would it look like? Who would be impacted? What countries would be hit? What would the reaction look like? And how will it impact me? How will it impact me? There used to be a comedian on SNL named Al Franken. He'd say, every time he'd tell a story about the world, he'd say, I know what you're asking. How will that affect me, Al Franken? But I think that's what people should be saying. How is climate change going to affect me? How are these things really going to involve me if I want to retire? If I want to have a good job, if I want to raise a family. You can't just say, well, Grandpa moved here from Germany, or Grandpa moved here from China this many years ago, or Dad moved here from Japan this many years ago, and so I'm here, this is where my family is. That is a surefire way to find yourself in a lot of trouble. And, the better thing to do is sit down and say, what's likely to happen, and how do I prepare for it? In the 1990s, I was a senior partner at Computer Sciences Corporation. And then I ran the strategy practice, and it was a big thing. But we also had a very, very, very large IT practice. In fact, that was the base of the company. That's why it was called Computer Sciences Corporation. Big government practice and a big civilian practice. And I was in a meeting one day in 1999, and the president of the company was there. And we were talking about Indian service providers, literally the people from India that were providing IT services. And their costs were significantly lower. There was a number of, they were grabbing up a lot of the business for a number of good reasons. And I was sitting there talking to him, and I said, and this is trend 1, and this is trend 2, and this is trend 3, and trend 4. We had all the leaders there. And the president of the company says, well, if those kinds of things happen, then, we just might as well pack up and go away. And I said, well, not if we plan for it. I mean, we should be hiring some people from India. We should be opening shops in India where we could outsource business. There's a plan that we go for this. And he's like, well, I'm not interested in doing that. I don't want to do business in India. He says, I like the government business. I don't have to have Indian people if I want to do government business. And if you people on the civilian side can't make it work without going to India, then I don't know what's going to happen. Well, the reality was, within 6 years, the business had lost 80% of its revenue. Its Computer Science Corporation doesn't even exist anymore. It's completely gone. Got blown up because of a lack of revenues, all because the senior leadership. So here's one of the 5 largest IT services providers in the country with a very huge government business, and in 8 years, they were put out of business by a trend that was easily identifiable. So start with where you live, start with your family, start with those things. How do I have a good life? But then apply it to your business as well. Where do I want to be? What kind of business do I want to have? And where should it be if I'm going to be successful?
Very well said, Adam. So this is something for all our listeners and viewers to be aware of. You just got to open your eyes to these trends. We've talked about trends a lot. We continuously talk about trends and how powerful they are in not only defining your business, but where it's going to go, where you want to live. I mean, everything's interconnected. We do have a report that is called, that basically lists the 66 trends. It's called Trend Report 2030. And basically it identifies 66 top trends and what you should be watching out for. So send me or Adam an email at manny@sparkpartners.com or adam@sparkpartners.com if you want a free copy of this. And you can take a look for yourself. What trends are going to be involved in your business and how can you be prepared for what's happening, even if you don't really know exactly how it's going to happen, but you do know something will happen. And I think that's the main thing. Final thoughts here, Adam, before we log off for this week?
I feel sorry for the people in Florida. I feel sorry for the people in Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, where Hurricane Ian went ahead. But take a look at Puerto Rico. 15 years ago, I started going to Puerto Rico. It was lovely. It has been hit by 3 hurricanes, and it's not a tourist attraction anymore. You are one step away from having that same impact in Florida. If it happened to Puerto Rico, it's going to happen in the Dominican Republic, and it's going to happen in Cuba, and it's going to happen in Florida. And you don't have to be a climatologist to know that. So take that and build on that.
Very well said, Adam. All right, with that, thank you for your time, and we will talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Cheers.